Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Nick Marsden. I'm chairman at Salisbury Foundation Trust, and I'm the chair of this particular session this morning. The title of the session is Candour, Trust and Common Cultures in a Collaboration and Partnership Working. Working in partnership and collaboration will require more than just process and infrastructure. It will require trust, development of cultures in common. This session looks at building trust and developing shared cultures. I'm joined by three colleagues to address that particular topic. Clive Lewis, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Globis Mediation Group. Matthew Trainer, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Barking, Havering and Redbridge NHS Trust. And Mary Elford, Chair of Cambridgeshire Community Services NHS Trust. Each of those colleagues will spend 10 minutes presenting to you about the particular topic. And after that, you will have the opportunity to ask questions of those three colleagues. If you wish to submit questions as we go through, that will be fine. And I will pick it up at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Clive to actually talk to us this morning.
Thank you very much, Nick, and good morning, everyone. We're talking about Candour, Trust and Common Cultures in Collaboration and Partnership Work. And as we've been hearing this morning, partnership working is becoming increasingly important. And as a result of that, collaboration and trust are vital to ensuring that partnerships can function and in particular continue to function well under pressure. And if we think about the link, considering how we want to ensure that patients receive or continue to receive optimum care in the journey, in the pathway from GP diagnosis to hospital admission and safe discharge, it's really important that there is strategic cohesion amongst partners. And in the few moments that I'm going to be speaking this morning, I want to talk particularly about the concept of trust and how vital that is. It's a really important component to ensure that there is and that there are strong relationships across systems. And if I think about and reflect on some of the work we do, which is primarily working with dysfunctional teams, there's normally 4 or 5 areas that we would reflect on when we think about dysfunctional teams. And usually the one at the top of the list is an absence of trust. And to help us, there's just one slide that I'd like to show this morning, because an absence of trust can be costly. So in the slide that I'm showing here, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of a trust tax and a trust dividend. When there's an absence of trust, things tend to work at a slower pace. They take longer. You might find that there's slower response times. You might find that colleagues have an unwillingness to meet. Maybe everything needs to be in writing. Things don't tend to speed up when there's a problem that needs solving. It feels as if it's really weighty. And all of those areas that I've just mentioned could be considered as a trust tax for an organisation or perhaps for a system. And that's the opposite to what in this model would be referred to as a trust dividend. So this is when everything moves much more quickly, actions are quickly followed up. You find that colleagues are likely to give extra discretionary effort. In other words, colleagues go the extra mile. And also there's a willingness to find solutions to problems that might occur. So we talk about trust I think, quite a lot. But it's useful to break down what we mean when we talk about this small word with such a big meaning. And if we just take that down just a little bit further to think about what we might see amongst leadership when there's an absence of trust. To understand trust, we would usually think about what I refer to as the 2 C's. So the first C is competence, and what our view might be about a leader's ability to be able to fulfill the role that they are in, whether that's in an organization or perhaps across a system. The second C is character. So we might each form a view about the way someone goes about doing their job. They may be highly competent, but there might be questions about the way in which they perform their role. So when there's an absence of trust, we'll experience some of the examples that I've just mentioned that relate to a trust tax. So I think one of the things that might be important to think about is what I would refer to as horizontal trust. So I would describe that as what we would see in an organization. And it's been interesting this morning to listen to the previous session that was referring to organization sovereignty and colleagues' willingness to give ground in that way. But I think there's another area, which is what I would describe as vertical trust, which is what we all need to focus on building now as systems are developing and coming into place. So I would talk about that as the trust that we see building and emerging across ICSs and ICBs. So in the last few minutes, what might we see in terms of how we might build trust if we're experiencing lower levels of trust or a low trust environment? We might want to see more of people being willing to admit perhaps where they've made mistakes, where there are weaknesses, where there are areas to be addressed. We might want to see more of people being willing to ask for help when needed and being willing to display what psychologists refer to as confident vulnerability, which means not being afraid to say that you don't know. If you don't know, that doesn't necessarily mean need to be seen as a point of weakness. A third point could be appreciating and tapping into each other's skills and experiences. Fourthly, being willing to be critical friends and looking forward to meeting to be able to work together as a group. And another thought would be thinking about the session that was just before this one, being willing to have debates about issues of organisation sovereignty. And if trusts and systems get this right, it's likely to result in a trust dividend where change happens quickly at far lower levels of cost. And of course, if we get it wrong, progress will be much more sluggish and will result in a trust tax. And finally, Nick, as I close, I would remind colleagues of a Dutch proverb that I heard some time ago, which is that trust arrives on foot and it leaves on horseback.
Thank you, Clive. Could I ask Matthew now to take us forward?
Thanks, Nick, and thanks very much for that, Clive. I've never ridden a horse. I have ridden a donkey, but I'll read into that what you will. Anyway, so for my session today, I just want to give you a few sort of practical reflections based on a couple of years as a chief exec in South London, where as part of the South London Mental Health Partnership, we really managed to deliver some effective collaboration between our services, and how I've taken those lessons into my current role in North East London. And hopefully some thoughts that might support all of us as we enter this kind of brave new world of ICSs, places and providers sitting somewhere between the two. And I'll build on some of what Clive said, because I think trust is key to this. So what I want to talk about is why do we collaborate, and what's the sort of engine room of it really, and how it's felt for me in practice, what matters and what doesn't. So the first thing really is to think about, why do you collaborate as providers of services? And it's about doing things better together than you can do separately. So the whole point of collaboration, it isn't about a structure, it's not about a governance framework. It's about looking at the services you run and the needs of the people that you're responsible for caring for, whether you're in social care or in the NHS or in the private sector, etc., and figuring out, how do we close the distance between their need and the services we can provide? And actually, what can we do better with other partners to make sure that people get a better service? And that, for me, is the heart of collaboration. And if you can't answer that question, what's going to be better for people because of this? Then you need to think about whether collaboration fits. So core, though, to me, to the success of collaborative models is probably three things, in addition to that, defining that service model. The first is about some shared values, and the next thing is about trust, which we've already heard a bit about. And then the third thing is about culture and how culture influences all those things around it. And in the first place, the values, they're the things that are core to why people choose to work in public service or in private service supporting the public sector. It's about what drives your success and inspires people to work together. And there is lots of common ground in this new world we're working towards. There's a real desire, I think, for all of us to get care closer to people's homes and, where possible, in their home. There's a real desire to improve the patient experience, to improve the outcomes we get. And there's a burning need to get better value for the taxpayer, whether that's national taxpayer or local taxpayer, to get better outcomes for the pound that we spend. And importantly, we've got to think about happier staff as well. You've got to have collaborative models that are more fun to work in. I play music. I like playing music by myself, but I enjoy it more when I play with other people, because what comes out is a more fulfilling experience, not just because of the product, but because of the experience of it. And we've got to be conscious of that element of joy in work that collaboration is an enabler for. I think we need to recognise that common ground between all the providers that are going to be part of these new networks, whether it's as commissioners or providers, but to try not to seek perfect matches. It's not perfect agreement between you all and your values. It's to seek that consensus areas, and at the kernel of what you're trying to do, to have that core of values that pull you together. The next thing around this is trust, and Clive said a lot about this, but I'm not going to say too much more other than it's built over time. It's built over consistency of behaviour. You start to trust someone when they can reliably be trusted to do what they do and do what you expect of them. And it's very easily damaged by things like breaking confidences, by talking outside of rooms about people, by taking an agreement away but not following through on it. And really, it was interesting when we were in South London talking to other patches in the country who were saying, how do we put together this provider collaborative? And our first advice was, well, I'd spend somewhere between 2 and 5 years learning to trust each other. It's a hard thing to accelerate, and I think Clive's point about pace in trust is really critical. It's hard won over time. It's very easily lost and can be lost extremely quickly, and once it's damaged, it's really hard to get back. And so that context of the shared values and the trust around it, what you're doing here is you're building layers about there's things we want to do together, and actually we're partners where we can work with each other to try to get the goals of this collaboration together. And this is a conversation that's happening in real time in parts of North East London at the minute. And in that context, it's important to understand the culture of the places you work in. Culture, I'd probably offered 2 definitions, and this was something I was at CQC working for Mike Richards for a while. We tossed around what culture meant a lot, and there's two good definitions. The good old plain one, how we do things around here. The other one I think is very interesting is, how do people think it's okay to behave when no one's watching? And sometimes, the default culture of an organisation when no one's watching is your desire still to do your thing as well as you possibly can. Do you think, I'm not on the hook for this, I'm going to walk away from it? And that how we do things around here is often where those other things start to founder. We need to recognise those differences and embrace them. And in the spirit of candour and around those common values and that need to build trust, we need to understand how people have got there and work out what those cultural differences are. The history of places is really important. The boroughs I'm working in now in East London, there's long memories of things that have happened in the past and what they mean for the context of the current relationship, for example, between NHS and social care. And people build lots of these cultures around stories. And what you need to do is spend a bit of time picking through those stories to identify what are myths and what are truths that have been driving some of those difficult behaviours. And really, over this thing, you're layering the values, you're layering the trust around it, but then you're trying to understand culture and recognise that you don't want a single culture, a sort of monoculture. You'll never get there between the different constituent parts of these systems. But you've got to find cultural shared points of contact where you can build around those shared goals and that sense of trust to really get you to where you want to be. And then the last thing I'll just talk about is about regulatory frameworks and how they drive culture. Lots of this is, crudely put sometimes, and you think about that in my kind of job sometimes, it's what gets you praised and what gets you fired. And how does that drive behaviours when you come into a collaborative space? I'm very conscious that my trust has running at a deficit at the minute that if I was a local authority chief exec, me and my top team would have been fired for. And we're in an environment here where we're asking different parts of the system to work together with regulatory frameworks, both in terms of quality, performance and finance, that do drive different behaviours and do drive different decision making. And there's something about recognising that as we try to find these common values, build that trust, layer that culture around it, that there are some pretty inflexible external constraints that do drive people in my sort of post, that drive people in local authority roles, on the political side of local authorities or commissioning roles, that drive them to behave in slightly different directions. And I think while you can start with the value stuff, if you don't start to recognise those really difficult sticking points, what you will repeatedly do is come up against something inflexible beyond which you cannot get because of one of these fixed points. And we found that sometimes in South East London, where there were sticking points between what the local authority and the trusts found as their drivers. And again, we're working through some of this in North East London at the minute. I mean, in this new system, we've got ICSs, we've got place, and we've got NHS trusts actually filling a rather strange place in between, where some of what trust services do are too small for the ICS, but they're too big for the place. And there's perhaps a growing expectation in place that they should have a far greater degree of say and control over some of that stuff that fills into the trust space. And for me, this is going to be one of those sticking points this year as we work our way through it. So it's really important we listen to the voice of place, understand those points of tension and try and work our way through it. And recognise we are entering a new phase where actually all these points of Candour, trust and collaboration are going to be different. It's, it's not comfortable this space we're entering into, but it can be hugely rewarding when you get it right. And my sort of final thought is, I think sometimes in the NHS, we think if we design a perfect system, we'll get perfect outcomes. And we can often spend far too much time on the design and the governance and the structures and not enough on just getting on with it. The best way to demonstrate that collaboration works is to give clinicians and their counterparts in the local authority space their head, let them get on with it. And when people see that success, they'll chase after it. And actually that sense of shared success at the heart of the values and the other things we've talked about that morning can be hugely powerful. So that's probably enough for me for now, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. So therefore, could I ask our final speaker, Mary, to take us through her view of the situation?
Thank you, Nick, and hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me to talk this morning. I'm Mary Elford. I'm Chair of Cambridgeshire Community Services NHS Trust, and we're a large community services provider. We work across 4 ICSs in the east of England. And we're an organisation that has always been very proud of our culture, which is very much built around around people, around our staff and our patients. And it's a dynamic culture that's been honed by the executive team for probably about 10 years. Very much based around the principles of collective and compassionate leadership. We're rated outstanding by the CQC and high score in pretty well all the indicators on the staff survey, and have been top scoring in the country under the Freedom to Speak Up Index for the last couple of years. So we are very much about our culture. That is how we see ourselves as an organisation. I've been a non-exec now since the early 2000s, and when I joined for my first board, which I think was in about 2002, I mean, culture just wasn't something that was talked about. I really don't think it was a focus of the board, and it's an area where I think there's been significant change over the last decade, and I think every board would now see working on the culture of the organisation as absolutely fundamental to our obligation and our accountability as organisations. So I think the debate we're having today is timely, because not only do we need to think about the culture of the partnership and working that we're entering into, but I think also how we can be ensure as boards that this doesn't dilute our focus as organisations on the culture of our own organisations, and that continues to be a priority and key to our accountability as trusts. So my trust are involved in two provider collaboratives or developing partnerships within two of the ICSs we work in. And I thought it might be helpful just to reflect on how those two have developed, and really picks up some of the points that both Clive and Matthew have raised earlier. The first one is an emerging provider collaborative called the Bedfordshire Care Alliance, which is within our Bedfordshire, Luton and Milton Keynes system. And I guess our experience there does chime very closely with what Matthew has outlined, where it came about through three chief executives of the acute, the community and the mental health provider, realising that the value in the working together, and they would only achieve the ambitions that they wanted to achieve within the Bedfordshire system by working in a more integrated way, by bringing community and acute closer together, by having better integration between mental and physical health. And it was very much generated by those three chief executives. This wasn't something that came from what was then only an emerging ICS. And I guess looking at the way this collaborative has developed, I would describe it as thinking big but starting small, and I think that's been a real ingredient in the success, because although the ambition for the people of Bedfordshire is huge, they very consciously started with discrete projects that would really make a difference. So I think the first project was around the Falls pathway, which obviously linked in acute community, dementia, and brought the clinicians working together in the way that Matthew described. But I think also allowed a shared understanding amongst the three chief executives about the styles of their different organisations and the styles that they own, their personal styles that they also had. And I think that has really developed the trust and really provided the groundwork for what is going to be, I think, an incredibly influential and important collaborative. So having started with on quite a limited basis, this collaborative will now be a subcommittee of the integrated care system. But 3 years on, we're starting to look at governance. So the governance is and the terms of reference, etc., are now being worked on. But the relationships and the trust between the three organisations have developed very effectively over the last few years. The next one I'd just like to touch on is in our Cambridge and Peterborough system, where we've been asked to lead a children, young people and maternity alliance. But that will, which will be the first time that some of the NHS bodies have come together. But it builds on very successful working over many years with the local authority and the voluntary sector within that system, and again very strong trust between certainly the clinicians in my trust and the social care and local authorities, which I think will provide a very strong foundation for that. The mission there, I think, is around inequalities, and I think that's what's driven the formation of this alliance, the particular concern for children. The outcomes within Cambridge and Peterborough are stark between the south and the north of the county. So that's very much the guiding principle in terms of why we need to work in that way in the future. So I guess 3 reflections from me on the collaboratives that we're currently involved in. Firstly, it does take time, and I think that it takes a long time to people to learn to work together, to learn the different styles that different trusts have, and to develop that shared understanding. But there needs to be investment and time in that before governance and some of the more formal structures take over. I think secondly, connection with a mission and developing that mission with our service users, with our local authorities, with our voluntary and community sector is vital. And there has to be a clear articulation of why we're doing what we want to do. Not that we've been told we have to have a provider collaborative, which certainly is something I've heard people talk about in other systems. So I think that articulation of the mission is vital. I think thirdly, acknowledgement that only by getting the culture right will we be successful. And we know from the work of people like Michael West that it is only through having collective leadership, compassionate leadership, that we actually achieve systems as well as trusts, where there is the psychological safety for innovation to thrive and for improvements in the quality of care to be achieved. I think finally, just thinking from a board perspective and as a chair, the three things that I guess I'm looking for. I want to know that we take our values into our collaboration. So I want to know that as a partner, we're as focused on equality, diversity and inclusion, on people participation, and on tackling inequalities in our partnership work as we are within our own trust. We're graded outstanding if we're well led. I want to know that we are outstanding as a partner. One of the questions for me is, I guess, how I would know. But I think it's really important that as a board, we can seek assurance that we are an outstanding partner in the collaborations that we work with. I think finally, I need to be sure that our accountability as a board for our own culture is not compromised by this and not diluted, and that we continue to learn and to hone our own culture as much as focusing on developing the culture in our collaborations. We've had a few quotes today about donkeys and horses and other things that happen if you don't focus on your culture. I guess the one that always chimes with me is that change happens at the speed of trust. Therefore, I think it's absolutely vital that we really focus on culture, because if we don't, we will not achieve the change that our collaborations have to achieve for our patients and communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. In fact, thank you all colleagues for the contribution you've made, including the quotes, which are quite interesting. Before I ask the audience for questions and such like, and I would encourage the audience to submit those as you think of them. Is there any? This is probably the first time you've heard the three of you actually with your presentations. Are there any thoughts that any of you have as a result of listening to somebody else's view of life and how it works with yours or doesn't work with yours? I take that as a no. So, okay. I'm going to kick off with a couple of
Matthew had his hand up.
Sorry?
Yeah, I stuck my hand up. All I was going to say, Nick, was how much common ground there was between us, really. We've all kept coming back to the same themes, and I think that just shows that we're picking on the right topics here. You've got three different perspectives, all honing in on exactly the same core elements here.
Absolutely, and you've all addressed the three elements that are in the title of this particular session, which is candour, trust, and culture, which leads to collaboration and partnership working. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. There is a large degree of consistency, which is very satisfying. I'm going to start with a question in terms of I'll probably start with you, Matthew, but Mary and Clive, please feel free to contribute afterwards. Establishing a baseline consensus or shared culture sounds like fantastic advice. Are there any examples of how you went about the process in practice, and at what point in the development of the partnership did this work? Anybody like to? I'm not getting any hands. Sorry, I'm not seeing the hands for reasons I don't understand. So please, Matthew, would you kick us off, and then let's say Mary and Clive can come in after that.
I think you're always working on developing your culture together. I think it's it's got to be your first go-to thing, and it's got to be the thing you keep coming back to. I think Mary mentioned the importance of CEO role modelling. I think that's critical. It needs to be seen by the senior leadership teams in organisations and by everyone in organisations that it's something that really matters to the chief execs. When we did the work in South London, I would stand up regularly with the chief execs of South London and the Marsden, South West London and St George's in front of a group of our staff and say, this is really important work. We do the same in the collaboration with BARTS I'm currently doing. Spending time together, sometimes getting a facilitators in good. Because there's that thing about seeing allowing someone to help reflect on some of perhaps the negative behaviours of your own organisation without people becoming defensive about it. And really important, I think, sometimes to get people together to talk about something that isn't the collaboration, but that delivers the cultural benefits of it, because people are talking about projects and pieces of work they're doing. And I found one of the most useful things is spending time together. There's often a bogeyman about the collaboration or about the partnership that kind of exists as an entity in people's minds, but when you pull the individuals from the other organisation into the room, it's not attached to any one of the individuals. And so within the BARTS BHRET collaboration, for example, I'm in a BARTS building at the minute next door to Charles Knight, who runs St Bart's Hospital. And this afternoon, our boards are meeting together. And it's about spending time together. And I would say that, bring your Neds in early, tell them what you're doing. So get together a lot. And the last thing I think is do have the courage to raise problems. And I suppose it's something that, in my career, I used to put off difficult conversations when I was less experienced. I think as you get more senior, they're the things you run towards. You rarely regret having a difficult conversation at the time it's needed. You often regret not having had it earlier. I think, and there's something about a partnership space and finding those opportunities to have those mutual conversations about frustrations, but to do so in a respectful way. The way to do it isn't a WhatsApp message to the third leg of the stool about the other leg of the stool. It's about getting folk together and having that chat and saying, look, this is causing me some problems. Here's why I'm worried about it. What can we do about it? So, lots of time together, and recognise that a mixture of Teams and face-to-face is a good idea. I know Teams enables us to do some things easier, and Zoom and whatever. There is something visceral about being in a room with people and having the smaller, less formal conversations off camera that really does help you build some of those common cultures where that's possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Mary, do you have a view?
I'm in danger of continually agreeing with Matthew. I think the time the more time you can put into those personal relations, the better. And certainly in the Bedfordshire Care Alliance, we've had regular sessions, probably every once a quarter, with just bringing the chairs and the chief executives together it started off as a dinner, then it became a kind of virtual early evening discussions, and throughout lockdown, and now we're back to meeting in person again. But actually building that chair and CEO relationship has been really important, and has definitely underpinned the success of the collaborative moving forward. Sometimes, though, I think there is a place for something that's a bit more structured and a bit more facilitated. We had a session with BLMK, which really focused on people bringing the things that they were worried about and sharing that together, and talking it through, and it was quite interesting because I was paired with the chief executive of one of our local councils, And it was quite interesting. We both brought the same problem, actually, and it was one of those rather strange things where you had to sit in pairs with your backs to each other. It had been designed by some psychologist, but in fact, the discipline of us talking through this shared issue from different perspectives. And the very fact that we've both chosen the same issue as our wicked issue really, I think, moved our relationships on hugely. So I think it's approaching these things from as spending as much time together as we can, just talking about these issues, but talking about it focused around particular problems, I think, is more successful than just trying to talk about culture with a big C. I think the more grounded it can be in addressing the issue at hand, the more you learn about each other and the more progress you make.
Thank you, Mary. Clive, do you have a few?
Thank you, Nick. I would say just one thing briefly. Matthew mentioned that he's a musician, I think, when he was speaking. I am too. I'm a bass player. And when Matthew mentioned that he's a musician, I thought of a book I've recently been reading by the sociologist Richard Sennett. And this is a book about rituals, pleasures, and politics of cooperation. And he says something in the book which I think is fascinating. He distills the difference between practice and rehearsal. So practice is essentially what you do as an independent musician to hone your skill and your craft. Rehearsal is what happens when you get together with others and then you put your craft into the pot, if you like, to see how that sounds with others being in the room, to see whether there is cohesion amongst you as a group of musicians or not. So when Matthew mentioned that, I thought about the difference between, if you like, practice being those internal discussions as a provider organisation against rehearsal being about the wider discussion and how those provider conversations play into the system, whether there's harmony or not, or whether something needs to be retuned or so on and so forth. So I think that was a good analogy for me.
Thank you, Clive. Very good. Second question from me before I move to the audience. The new Act requires providers to work in collaboration. Do you foresee any challenges for provider boards if there is an expectation to collaborate where mutual trust is difficult to establish? Put another way, should inability to establish a firm foundation of candour and trust mean that providers should not seek to take a partnership forward?
Maybe I can start off on this one, Nick.
Surely.
Some of the thoughts I've got is about willingness to take risk. And there are differences between what organisations would describe as a low trust environment. If I just refer back to some of the comments I made earlier, in a low trust environment, it becomes far more difficult. There's always much more tension compared to a high trust environment where you might be willing to take more risks. But a few examples come to my mind. For example, urgent and emergency care and the tension that might exist between an acute trust and ambulance services. Is there alignment? Is one blaming the other? Patients having to be seen in the back of an ambulance because they are not able to get them into hospital, for example. A second example might be discharge for medically fit patients. Is there space in the community for those patients to go? And as a result, is there tension that rises and develops between acute and community, or is there a sense of blame because there is misalignment, there isn't space being developed? And maybe a third might be those in communities who are frequently calling on services. And as a result, is there a conversation or some tension between maybe the local authority or even the police services to see what can be done to make sure that that small group of people aren't putting enough pressure, aren't putting too much pressure on the system. So there are 3 examples that come to my mind, but I think that what's there is for me is, you know, the risk that colleagues will have to take to have some of those more difficult conversations when some of those areas are playing out and it looks as if there is blame being apportioned. The conversations will be required to try and work through the difficulties to get on track to go much more in line with the direction that's going to be best for the providers and the patients.
Thank you, Clive. Matthew, do you have a view?
Yeah, I mean, I thought just in the example Clive used there about ambulance services, I mean, Queen's, one of my two hospitals, is quite notorious, I think, in some respects for having, certainly at the minute, the worst type 1 emergency department performance in the country, although not for much longer, and also for some really quite serious issues with ambulance handovers. And when I got there last August and you went down to the emergency department, what you had was very frustrated paramedics who wanted to get back out on the road and stood by typically quite frail, elderly, unwell patients on trolleys, and really frazzled ED doctors and nurses and others who just didn't have any space to move the patients on. And so what you had, and it was like a sort of you know, angry town centre pub on a Friday night, really, you know, and it was not what you wanted to see in a healthcare setting. Really, 2 sets of people who actually, because they felt their values were being compromised, were coming into clash with each other, and it was creating friction where we didn't want to see that friction. And we've opened a new area within the ED that basically we now, London Ambulance now employs 2 of its staff to stay in our emergency department on a rota and look after patients so they're in cubicles rather than on the corridor. And it's released 10,000 hours worth of paramedic time now since December. Really good model of care. But actually what was more important around that, I say a really good model of care, it's a stick and plaster to fix an unacceptable situation, but it's better than the alternative at the minute. But what was most powerful about it was that our team and the LAS team sat down together and said, we all hate this. You know, it makes us feel sick every time we end up in this set of circumstances. Let's design a standard operating procedure together around it to try to fix it. And actually, it was the act of doing it as much as it was the outcome that's improved the relationships there. And actually, the first place we tried to put it in didn't work particularly well. It was a bit too far away from the ED. Paramedics were a bit worried about sick patients going off. It didn't quite work. So we got back together again, not happy about this, let's change it. And what we created was, bang on about this, set of shared values. We think this is terrible, we want to change it. And we found that we built that trust over time. Let's try and sort this out together. And then we found the common ground around the culture, which was to fix it and to be honest with each other when we were frustrating each other. And we've now got you know, really positive relationship there. And you know, the medical director of LAS would say it's one of the most positive in the region now for being one of the worst. And it's just a really practical example of the stuff Clive's been talking about there, and that Mary's been talking about. You know, we have far more in common than we have that divides us. The tension, I think, back to your original question, is when you get to, you know, if you're the board of a foundation trust, I'm not in an FT at the minute, but I was before, you know, you have a very strong legal duty over the proper use of the resources that you're allocated. Now, actually, in a place-based context where you might have other partners who want to get their hands on some of that money and think about how they spend it differently, it takes quite a leap of faith to delegate some very direct legal accountabilities and responsibilities to other partners who might be able to make better use of it, but who, if they fail, actually, what does that mean for you? And that's where I go back to, actually, you can get the culture, you get the shared identity. Sometimes we need to be very clear there are regulatory fences and borders that create really important points of tension that we are going to have to spend a lot of time looking at and thinking about in the next 2 years.
Thanks, Matthew. Mary, do you have a view?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think, you know, we're public servants working with public money. If we can't get shared values, there's something very wrong, and I think it behoves everyone in a system to fix it and not let this get in the way. So I think from this sort of scenario that you described in the question, you know, I think every provider would need to be held to account, and I guess it would be through whether it's through region or the ICS to not let that situation continue, and to think hard what would make the change. I mean, one of the things that, you know, along with the kind of work on relationships and shared problem solving in the way that Matthew has described. I guess the other thing I would add is just bringing in the voice of patients and the public, and actually looking at experience of those receiving care as a catalyst for bringing out the shared values that organisations should have. I can think of one example. We had of a patient story of a young mother with a child who had had oxygen deprivation at birth and cerebral palsy. And the difficulty that she was just having with the whole pathway between the hospital, the community services, the local authority. And she gave one particular example of trying to get a feeding chair that her child needed. And she's, one of the questions we asked is, what kind of changes that she would like to see. And she said, I just don't want to see people arguing in front of me and my child about who's going to pay for a feeding chair. And I think it held everyone to account. And I asked that this story go to our ICS board as well, because I think sometimes if you actually hear patients talk about how some of these issues of clashes of values play out, in her case, in her own front room, then it behoves all of us to do better. So I think sometimes bringing in a stronger patient voice can really help unlock and expose some of these issues that all of us have to take responsibility for tackling. Thank
you, Mary. I have a question from the audience, and this is from Kathy Lilly. And I'm very happy with the discussions we've just had, because the question is there any learning around building culture and relationships you feel you can share? I.e., what hasn't gone well and what did you do about it? And I think, if you like, we have covered that in those questions. But Kathy, does that answer your question, or have you got a nuance that we haven't addressed? Okay. I assume silence means that we have at least addressed it in some shape or form, which is good. I have a final question again that's actually pertinent to the environment we're working in, and from the 1st of July we'll be increasingly working in. Is there an opportunity for ICBs to set expectations about the culture and the ways of collaborating within their footprints? Would this be welcome, do you think? Who would like to kick that off?
Yeah, I think, Nick, that there's a real opportunity now for ICBs to set the tone about what the intended direction of travel will look like. And maybe one way of doing that would be to think about who's in the room. So in addition to those who have been appointed as non-execs and execs of the new ICBs, inviting key players from each of the providers to be in the room to think about and work through some key decisions. So, for example, thinking about plans to grow the substantive workforce differently. The workforce is probably the biggest challenge that we have. So as many people being in the room as possible would be useful. Maybe thinking about how you would rapidly and consistently develop new models of care that try to exploit new technology, perhaps, or maybe having a conversation about how we can ensure that levels of productivity move beyond where they were before the pandemic, or maybe looking at how allocated additional levels of government funding will be used for particular levels of increasing capacity. You know, those types of examples, if the ICB leads can invite provider leaders into the room to thresh those things through, I think that's going to go a long way to building a sense of the culture that they are trying to work towards.
Thanks, Clive. Mary, Matthew, got a view?
I got one or two quick suggestions. I mean, our chair of our ICB, Marie Gabriel, I mean, she's just relentless in her focus about the importance of addressing health inequalities in North East London and recognising the real poverty and deprivation that we deal with in some patches. And, you know, we've just come through a 2.5-year period where we've seen actually, I think probably more vividly than any point in any of our lifetimes, that economic inequality and the often racial discrimination that drives economic inequality in our part of London has killed people and harmed people disproportionately because of their lack of life chances. You know, the reason we had higher death rates in our part of London is because we had a lot of members of staff, a lot of staff and a lot of local residents who had no choice about going to work during the pandemic. They weren't sat at home in their spare rooms ordering takeaway food and you know, Ocado deliveries. They were out in buses, or they were going on, you know, I mean, you know, the difference between, you know, Plaistow train station first thing in the morning and some of the more rarefied parts of South East London was really striking during the pandemic. And you could see who had a choice or not, whether to put themselves in the line of fire for this. And I think, you know, our ICB is setting a very strong tone about us addressing that. The other really important point, as Clive's mentioned there, is about who's in the room. You know, and Mary and one or two others, we did mention about the patient voice. I think sometimes we say we want the patient voice. I think sometimes we don't want to listen to it. I think sometimes we want someone who allows us to say we invited a patient to this board, but then we talked in absolute jargon for 3 hours. They didn't have a clue what we were talking about. And then they left with us all feeling slightly satisfied that we'd involved patients. Actually, if you want to open yourself up to different perspectives, you've got to be prepared to listen to people say, do you know what you're doing? It's not very good. It doesn't really suit our needs anymore. We don't really like the way you've designed it. If you're serious about that, ICBs can set a tone by getting those folk and those voices in at a higher level very early on, because once you set off in a direction, you're kind of on rails. And then, you know, the views you'd get from a group of more junior staff in their 20s and 30s who are much more ethnically diverse and represent the local population are different from a group of 50-year-old white people on healthy salaries who live outside London in nice big houses and are thinking about the same problems. And we still see too much of that in the NHS. You know, certainly in my own trust at the minute, our executive team and board does not represent the people that we represent, and ICBs have got a chance to say that won't wash in our leadership structures.
Thanks, Matthew. Mary?
I think clearly there is a role for the ICS to broker some of these discussions, but I suppose I'd just be wary of the ICS boards sort of saying, you know, this is the culture that you're all going to work to. I think it needs to be owned by the constituent parts, and I think there's a key role for the ICSs in brokering that and holding us to account. And I think the example of driving work on inequalities, on population health, on use of big data. You know, I think through having a relentless focus on that at the ICB level, that will drive changes to the culture within individual organisations. But I do think it's vital that trust boards retain that accountability for the culture of their organisations and continue to hone and develop that. Focusing on people participation for us is absolutely fundamental to everything we do. For an acute trust, it's slightly different. So, they will approach that in a different way. So, I guess I'd be reluctant for a kind of one size fits all. But I do think the role modelling and brokering role of the ICB is going to be increasingly important here.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. We have 5 minutes left. Very quick one. Have you experienced any challenges bringing busy senior leaders on board to prioritise these relationships? And have you found that relationships work better if they are devolved responsibility to more junior leaders working at place, or does it need senior focus in order for those engaging are able to make decisions and commitments? I.e., where is it in the hierarchy that these things can be solved or not?
Needs both, I would say, just briefly. And if it's not an addition to the job, it is the job. You know, the ICS is not a thing that separates the trusts. You know, the trusts are the biggest engine rooms in the ICS in terms of where the money's spent, certainly. So, I mean, when I was at Oxley's, I did probably a good solid day a week, possibly a day and a half a week on collaboration. And actually, interested in my current job, one of my challenges is I'm doing too much daily firefighting to find the time for this. And that's where the collaboration with Barts is offering us the headspace. So I say, you do have to delegate and give people across the organisation a chance to participate, but senior people need to recognise this is a core part of their job, and they need to set an example to folk. You know, you can always find another thing to fix in a hospital, but unless you start to think about where you're heading rather than the ground in front of your feet, we'll never get out of the holes that we're in.
Mary, do you have a view?
I have to say this is major focus for all the senior leadership within my organisation, it's a challenge for us given the geography we work in, but it is absolutely fundamental. Collaborating with others is one of our 4 strategic objectives. We have reports on our collaboration at every board meeting. Only if I think having that senior focus is the only way we're going to make progress with it. But for us, it's the only way we will actually achieve the outstanding care that we want to deliver for our patients and our public. So it's absolutely mission critical if we're going to succeed.
Thank you, Clive. Final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I think I would just endorse what I've heard both Mary and Matthew say, in particular about there needing to be a blend and a mix, but certainly senior people or decision makers need to be in the room making a contribution to get things started. I don't think I'd say anything further to that. Thank you.
Well, can I thank all 3 of you? Can I thank Clive, Matthew, Mary for the contribution you've made. I am in where BSW is our to-be ICS, and its development is certainly not as extended as the three of you have described as possible. So from a personal perspective, I found this session incredibly useful. And I hope I speak on behalf of the audience in terms of they find it incredibly useful as well. So can I thank all three of you for your contribution? Really, really valuable thoughts and ideas and such like. So thank you for that. Can I thank the audience for their participation and involvement? And I wish you all the very best in trying to introduce candour, trust and common cultures in the ICSs and the organisations that you represent, and therefore leading to significant collaboration and partnership working. So thank you all for attending, thank you all for contributing, and I wish you the rest of the day is as useful as this session has been. Thank you.